worried I was going to have to entertain you with dance for a minute. Like, what are they trying to tell me? So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event, The Climate Decade. Will states, businesses, and cities be the heroes we need for the 2020s? I've got a little bit of housekeeping. I don't normally like housekeeping stuff, but every time a motorcade rolls past, they block the radio signal, which blocks the mics, and you will get an electric shock to the ears. That's not the venue, it's not us, it's the president. So that's what's happening. And I'm very sensitive to sound, so you'll probably first be alerted because I'll jump backwards dramatically in the air and then you'll hear it and then we'll carry on. So apologies if that happens. So last year, the IPCC put out an incredibly sobering report. It came October last year, made an incredibly compelling case that we have to work towards 1.5 degrees C of warming. We're going to hear a bit more later on about that science. But essentially before that, we had the Paris Agreement to get to, aim for 2 and follow attempts to get to 1.5. What that report said is we've got to go for 1.5. And if we want to be able to do that, we've got to move very quickly, get serious, and at least halve emissions over the next decade. So we're talking about the 2020s as the climate decade. You've heard of the roaring 20s, the swinging 60s. It's not quite as catchy, but the 2020s is going to be the climate decade. And we told all of you who were there at the opening ceremony yesterday, we set this out. We started to outline the to-do list. This morning is about getting really into the detail of that. So we've got 3 sessions for you, and then some speakers in between. So the first session, we're going to be looking at a vision for 2030. What does it look like if we've halved emissions in that period? Where are we going to? Then our second set of speakers, we'll talk about what's happening in the middle of the decade, looking at some innovations and initiatives that are starting now, seeing how those are going to play out in the next few years. And then in our final session, we'll be looking at the next year. What's our to-do list now, walking away? What do we need to get done in the next year? We've got some great speakers lined up for you this morning, really covering all those different stakeholder groups who'll be coming to tell us what they're doing individually, but also how do we all need to work together to drive this agenda. So thank you to all of you for joining. I really want to thank the sponsors for this morning's session and to all our supporters for Climate Week NYC. And to get things going, I'm going to ask Jakob Askar-Buus from Ørsted to the stage to set the scene. He's the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Stakeholder Relations with Ørsted. He's been named the most sustainable energy company in the world. He's led the strategy to take the company from one of Europe's most coal-intensive utilities to be on track to be carbon-free in 2025. And you'll have noticed hopefully you're not sitting on your VR headsets, but you can see something pretty exciting is about to come. So, Jakob.
Well, thank you, Helen, for that introduction. And I believe that most of us in this room probably agree how important it is to speed up climate change. And yet, after 10 years of talking about the issue, we see that emissions keep going up and we are really not making the progress we need. And as communications professionals, we also need to reflect on how we are actually communicating when it comes to climate change. Many of us have probably tried to beef up our communication, really telling about all the dire consequences of climate change, and we're really seeing that it is not really working. So we also need to find new ways of engaging people around the serious challenges ahead. And at Ørsted, we have tried to do something different. We have taken state-of-the-art virtual reality technology to develop an astronaut's perspective of what the world looks like from outer space. And with this, which the astronaut call the overview effect, we get a sense of belonging that occurs when we see the planet from outer space. So I would invite you to take on your virtual reality goggles from your seat and get ready to go into space. There is a button.
Before we launch, I want you to take a good look around. It's beautiful here, don't you think? Now, you may not recognize this, but take my word for it, this is your home. Here we go. Take off in 3, 2, 1.
So before we begin, you need to press the little button that is to the side of the on your headset. The one which is indicated with an arrow. Outside, you look outside of the goggle, you find an orange arrow, you press the button, and then we should be ready to begin.
Or there's a little clicker under their seats.
Yeah, they should not use that.
Oh. Here. Yeah. Yeah.
When you see a picture of Mike Massimino inside the goggle, you know that you're good.
How are people doing? Got it?
Anyone not seeing Mike in the goggle? Raise your hand. We'll help you.
Right, let me press the button for you.
Yeah, it's showing a power off menu, and there's no little dot to choose restore.
There's a button.
Raise your hand if you're not seeing Mike in the goggle.
Okay, really? Okay, just for not me.
Oh, this one, they say there's a controller under your seat. It was hanging on a clip. I know, but it says power off on it.
It says power off. Oh wait, now it's dark.
Before we launch, I want you to take a good look around. It's beautiful here, don't you think? Now, you may not recognize this, but take my word for it, this is your home. Here we go. Take off in 3, 2, 1. Are you still with me? We are now 300 meters above sea level and climbing. Have a look around. It still may not look like the place you consider home, but give it another minute. You are now 100 kilometers above sea level and officially in space. Let's find a good place to stop. Take a deep breath and look at where you've come from. Do you recognize it now? You can no longer see the lake, the beautiful trees, or the green grass. But now you see why it's all part of the place that is our home. This amazing planet we all share. The first time I saw Earth from space, I thought it was an absolute paradise, and we're so lucky to be able to live here. It made me realize that despite our differences, we are all in the same boat or spaceship, and it gave me a sense of a great connection with every living thing on that tiny pale blue dot. Among astronauts like me, we call this feeling the overview effect. Just take a moment to let it all sink in before you start your journey back home. Look at the northern lights and the galaxy behind. And do you see that thin blue line surrounding our incredible planet? That's the atmosphere, and it has sustained all life on Earth for millions of years. Earth is an extraordinary place, but lately, our way of life has become a threat to the very home we depend on. We have upset the balance within our environment and caused the climate to change. we need to take responsibility, not just for causing it, but for fixing it. Because it's not enough just to love our home. We need action. Let's go back. Okay, we're home. Thank you for taking the time to see the world, our home, from my point of view. I'll leave you here to enjoy the sunset. This is Mike Massimino, signing off.
So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the ride. The challenge we face as a global community is enormous, and we need really to change at scale over the coming climate decade, as Helen said. In my company, Ørsted, we are an example that massive change at scale, or at least at company scale, is possible. 10 years ago, our core business was in fossil fuels. It was in oil, coal, and gas. And earlier this year, we were named the most sustainable energy company in the world. We've been through a massive transformation where we, since 2006, have reduced our CO2 emissions by 83%, faster than the science requires in order to stay within the 1.5 degree scenario. And by 2025, we will have reduced our CO2 emissions by 98%, making our energy production essentially carbon neutral. This change has been driven by our realization that we needed to reinvent our business model, both to be financially sustainable in the long term, but also to be environmentally sustainable in the long term. And the transformation has led us to become one of the world's largest renewable energy companies today, really building out renewable energy across 3 continents, Europe, the US, and Asia. What we've seen over this journey is that renewable energy has become cheaper than fossil fuels to build, and that is really the driver that will help us in the next decade as we transform the world's energy systems. There is no longer any reason to keep on building power production based on fossil fuels. It is cheaper to build renewable energy, and that is a major milestone for the green transformation. So in Ørsted, we are here in New York to share our optimism that big change is indeed possible, and it is possible within a decade to transform fundamentally from black to green. So let's get to work, and thank you for taking part in the VR journey to space.
Thank you, Jakob. And that was I hope you got it working and it was a good experience. I felt a little, that's why I didn't become a spaceman. Now I'd like to welcome to the stage Justin Warlam from Time magazine, where he is an energy and environment writer, and he will be moderating our first panel, looking out to 2030 and asking what we are aiming for.
Thank you for that. Before we get to the panel, we have Lord Adair Turner, who's going to present. He's from the Energy Transitions Commission, and if you aren't familiar with it, they look at produced analysis on hard-to-abate sectors and how to get there. He's a businessman and an academic with a lot of experience in this space, so please welcome Lord Turner.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I've got 5 minutes, I believe, to just answer this question, 2030, what are we aiming for? But I'd like to start with 2050, and then, having defined where we've got to be in 2050, define what we've got to do in 2030. So the Energy Transition Commission is a global coalition of companies and NGOs. We have members from Europe, India, China, Australia. Not enough in America so far. We've got to work on that. But we are united in the belief that we have got to meet the Paris Climate Agreements and indeed the 1.5-degree target. In order to do that, we essentially have to get the world to net zero by mid-century. And our interpretation of that is absolute net zero in every developed economy by 2050, and maybe another 10 years for some of the emerging countries to catch up. But a crucial point is, zero must mean zero. There's a whole load of models out there of people who say they've got science-based targets, or say they're aiming for net zero, and you'll find in their model that they're assuming that by 2050 they'll be buying enormous amounts of offsets to balance their sector. But if every sector is at net zero, you can't buy any offsets from another sector. And if you're assuming that you can buy a whole load of offsets from the land use sector, remember that that's a one-off. It's not a permanent. You can't permanently go on buying it. So we've got to get to net zero in the industrial economy by 2050. And our analysis, which has been set out in this report, Mission Possible, says what it says on the tin, that it is mission possible, even in the hard-to-abate sectors, in steel, in petrochemicals, in cement, in aviation, in shipping and trucking, to get all of those sectors to net zero. There may be some carbon capture and storage, but not all that much. That's why the phrase net is there. There may be some need for that by 2050. And our analysis also shows that it is absolutely possible to do that at a cost to the economy which is really quite trivial, less than 1% of GDP. And if we're not ready to give up 1% of our standard of living in 2050, a standard of living which, if we achieve growth, will probably be double the present level, then we really are the pathetic generation. So that is what we've got to achieve by 2050. What does that mean for 2030? Well, it crucially means that we can't just say, well, we'll sort it all out in the 2030s and 40s. Because there are a set of things which, if we don't do them in the next decade, it will be completely impossible to get to net zero by 2050. One of those is to build more green, renewable electricity. There is no way to a net zero global economy which does not involve massive electrification. We believe that total global electricity demand will have to go up from about 23,000 terawatt hours today to order of magnitude 90,000 terawatt hours by 2050, and every single one of those terawatt hours has got to be zero carbon. To get there, we have got to increase the pace at which we are building renewables by about 3 or 4 times the current annual level and maintain that for the next 30 years. It's completely doable. If you compare the investment needs with total global savings and investments, it's completely and utterly doable, but we need the policies to do that, and we need to put them in place now. Secondly, we have got to completely electrify road transport. Now, some of that may be in the form of hydrogen for long-distance trucks, but it's fundamentally electric engines. But we won't have a completely zero-carbon, fully electric system by 2050 unless the vast majority of our trucks and autos are being built in bought in a zero-carbon electric fashion well before that. We need to pull forward those policies. And that's why I believe that there should be policies throughout the developed world to ban the sale of internal combustion engines from 2030 and to ban internal combustion engines from our streets by 2040. Now, I'm getting on in life. If I keep fit, have a good diet, should be fairly clear of getting through to 2040. Lucky, 2050. I want to come back here in 2040, and I want there to be no petrol and diesel vehicles on the street. It'll be such a nicer environment in which to operate. But we've also got to do with things like plastic. Somebody said earlier, I think there was a comment that there will be plastics in 2050, but they've got to be completely and utterly recycled. But we've got to get on with that quickly. So we've got to start taking bold moves like banning plastic incineration from 2025, and therefore forcing the development of a plastics recycling industry which will not develop on scale rapidly enough to get us where we need to be unless we put in place the incentives now. We have to unleash the power of capitalism to solve this problem by having absolutely clear, strong targets. On steel and cement, we have got to create the incentives for those companies to begin to take action now because their cement kilns and their steel plants last for 30 years or even more. So all the way across the sectors of the economy, it is absolutely vital to accelerate progress dramatically in the next 10 years. And that involves both the use of market instruments like prices, but it also involves, in some sectors of the economy, just making strong, bold regulations within which markets can then help deliver what we need to do to be in 2030 on the route to net zero by 2050. Thank you very much.
So for the panel, we have, I'll introduce the panelists and then they'll, I guess, take a seat. We have Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham.
Thank you.
From New Mexico, I should add. Yes, please. Basil Seggos, who is the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation Commissioner. And then we have Thelma Krug, who's the Vice Chair of the IPCC, and Frank Jensen, who's the Lord Mayor of Copenhagen.
I can see when I'm up there that has my presentation on the floor. Thank you. We're just going to rotate.
Let's start with Dr. Krug, just to give a little bit of context for the 2030 target. Remind us of where the IPCC says we need to be and what the consequences of not getting there by 2030 would be.
Okay, thank you, and it's nice to be here. So let's talk a little bit about the 1.5 global warming report of the IPCC, where at least two of the messages from the report have already been said here. One of them is that we must get a very expressive cut in CO2 emissions by 2030, by 45%. And we also heard that by 2050, we should have net zero CO2 emissions, and in parallel, deep emission cuts in non-CO2 emissions. Okay, so let me contextualize that. Obviously, that is the target that we see that will lead us more smoothly to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Otherwise, there is an otherwise there. You're going to have much more difficulty. It's going to be much more challenging to limit global warming to 1.5 at the end of the century. And attached to that complexity, you also have escalating costs the more we delay the implementation of the actions, and also projected to have harsher impacts and risks. So what we say is that 2030 is not a deadline, it's a milestone. It's a milestone to see and to show if we are on track to be in 1.5 at the end of the century. And obviously, the report is very clear. I think I'm going to just give this last message so that others can have the opportunity to talk. One of the messages of the IPCC is that it is not impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels at the end of this century. But it did say that is going to take unprecedented efforts in all areas of society. So the earlier we start, and we are not eliminating anyone from this equation. So we are talking about governments at all levels, private sector, we are talking about communities at large. So we are talking about, low carbon intensive diets. So we are touching the way of the everyday life of each one of us. So I think that everyone now with that report has a share of responsibility. And obviously for the industry, this is really a big challenge. So we see that there are opportunities, more than, huge opportunities over there that the industries have to explore and start earlier. There is competitiveness in that equation as well. So we are really looking forward to reach those milestones by 2030 and 2050. Otherwise, it's going to be much more difficult and much more expensive.
Great. So I think a great way to sort of introduce all of you with that context in mind is to talk about your vision for 2030. Where do you see your city and your states in 2030 to align with that science? And we can just go down the line.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very proud and happy to give the city perspective on this topic and this issue. In my city, Copenhagen, we decided back in 2009 to become the first carbon neutral capital city by 2025. It is very ambitious, I know that, but we are well on our way. We have already reduced carbon emissions with 42% from 2005 until 2014. And we have invested heavily in our city to make the city green and livable, because we see make a city green is also a question about livability in a city. And we started make it mandatory to be connected to our district heating system. Today, 99% of all households in Copenhagen are linked to our very efficient district heating. Now we are transforming our power plant from coal and to certificated biomass. I know that will be, for some years we have to use biomass, certificated biomass, but we also have introduced infrastructure for biking. So we also look at mobility. We have invested more than 100 million euros in bicycling infrastructure in Copenhagen. So today, more than 50% of the Copenhageners use their bike for daily transportation to work or school. And I think that makes a lifestyle also for the Copenhageners to be a partner with the green transformation of their city. Now we have also introduced new innovative solutions in the city, for example, district cooling, because cooling will be an issue for many cities in the coming years. We take the cold out of the water in our harbor and distribute cold in the pipes beside our district heating pipes. And we can reduce electricity for cooling down buildings with 70% for electricity. So we innovate a lot of new solutions together with the business and industry and together with research fellows, because we see Copenhagen as a kind of laboratory for innovating new solutions, because we are partner in the organization C40. We are nearly 100 cities around the globe leading the green transformation in the cities. And 70 big cities around the globe have committed themselves to the toughest target of the Paris Agreement. And we are going to deliver on the Paris Agreement in the C40. And I'm looking forward to see my colleagues in C40 in Copenhagen next month, where we are hosting the Global Mayors Summit, and we will discuss the next steps for the cities to take the leadership of the green transformation of the big cities.
Thank you. Yeah. Commissioner.
Oh, thank you. On behalf of Governor Cuomo, welcome to New York, everyone. Certainly beautiful week this week. Start talking about 2030. I roll it back to 2012 when I first started here working for the state, and watching the ocean pouring into the World Trade Center construction site, I think was a turning point for, at least for New Yorkers, when they transformed their thinking about climate change from polar ice caps to right here in our own city. And that's when I think, began to turn talk into action. We saw decent amount of investment going into renewables over the years, but really at that point we started thinking about a holistic change in the way the state operates, both adaptation and emissions. On the adaptation side was all the recovery dollars, putting billions into using natural shoreline protections to prevent storm surge. We're seeing similar conditions up in Lake Ontario now with high water levels. We've got our own teams fighting fires out in California as well as in New York. So we recognize this climate change imperative and the need to both adapt and work on the emissions side. So on the emissions side, very happy and been very busy this year with what I guess the New York Times called the most ambitious climate legislation passed. And it is so for a reason, very ambitious climate targets, 85% reduction in emissions economy-wide from 1990 levels by 2050, 40%, or rather 2040, clean energy on the power grid. And getting to that point, getting to 2030, 2040, 2050, with all of the targets we've set is going to be an enormous challenge. There's no doubt about it. The law itself that we signed here in New York City just a few weeks ago recognized the need to bring in stakeholders from all of the sectors that will be impacted. So it's not big government saying you must do X, Y, and Z. It is help us get to this point. We have to find a solution together and ultimately begin making putting that plan together and working on it quickly. Not waiting also is very important. We banned fracking in 2015 in New York State. We banned coal and power. We said no to offshore oil and gas this year with the legislature. It's good to say no to things, right? But you have to transform the economy at the same time. So as we set these target goals, just talk about Ørsted. At the same event we signed this legislation a few weeks ago, we also announced the 1.8 gigawatt commitment on just one wind farm out in Long Island, 9 gigawatts total on wind by 2025 or 2030, and then similar commitments on solar and storage. So we've been pouring literally billions of dollars into this, billions of dollars of commitment, so that we're not waiting for any plans or targets to hit. We're in fact making those investments right away. And certainly knowing that we can't do this alone as a state, co-funding the U.S. Climate Alliance, the Governor Cuomo, Governor Inslee, and Governor Brown 2 years ago, I think this week, here in New York, working across the country, including now with New Mexico, looking for ways to transform our nation's approach to clean energy and renewables. Even with no federal involvement, now we have 50%, 57% of the U.S. economy now behind us. So we see it as, if this is this existential issue that we recognized back in 2012 with Superstorm Sandy, either exists or you don't. If you want to adapt and meet the crisis, well, there's plenty of opportunity, and you move your economy, look for the jobs of the future within the renewables movement and help others along the way.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Governor?
Thank you very much. So, common theme. We've got countries, cities, states taking leadership roles and also being accountable and responsible. New Mexico is a state, like many southwestern states, that may feel a bit exempt from glaciers melting and sea levels rising. And although not quite exempt now that the Amazon is burning, we do have some of the most intense wildfires. They're hotter, they burn longer because we're drier. And we've often, New Mexico is a drought-ridden state. But we're now in the aridification phase of drought. There isn't a single place on Earth that is exempt from the ravages of climate change. And I really appreciate Basil's comment that too many individuals, if you're not right at the coast or watching the impacts at a glacier, you may feel a little exempt. So that's part of changing how people perceive where they are in this crisis. Two, we're a state long known for the only economic effort, really, in the extractive industries. So we're a fossil fuel state. This makes it increasingly challenging for policymakers. And so the easy thing to do, we're a small state, this is everybody else's problem. And when it's cheaper, when it's easier, when it's all of those things, then states like ours sort of jump in the fray. Now, we decided not to do that. It is real. We're seeing those ravages. We know that the best response economically, if that's going to be part of the argument, is to transition to renewable energy. We also happen to be one of the sunniest and windiest states in the country, and per capita, a place that rivals anywhere in the world for sun and wind. So you want to make an economic argument? Well, we're having huge investments in renewable energy. How do you do that as a policymaker? You set ambitious renewable portfolio standards, and you prioritize making those investments and making sure that you can get that energy onto the grid, you do your transmission lines, and you support those investments. Why else would you do that if it's not economically prudent and effective? It's also cheaper for consumers. So if you're protecting your consumers in the energy markets, then you want renewable energy. And if all that wasn't enough, I mean, climate change is enough, but the arguments for delaying are gone. The crisis now can be buttressed by policymakers and leadership in states by showing that all of the arguments work. And in the fossil fuel industry, by making sure that your utilities are clear about being carbon neutral, so you set those milestones and those goals. So we did all of that. We're going to reduce our emissions by 45% in the next decade. We're going to make sure that we're carbon neutral, meeting those threshold targets by the U.S. Climate Alliance. We've set really aggressive renewable portfolio standards. We've done that so our largest utility in the state has to be carbon neutral by, the law says 2045. They're going to do it by 2040. And I think we're the only state in the country that has these small rural electric co-ops. It's less flexible for them, so they believe, based on where they purchase, what kind of power they deliver. So we're the only state that got all of those small operators in line. We gave them a little more time to reach those goals, but quite frankly, I think with the kind of synergy that we're seeing around the country and in the Southwest, and that we're going to be selling our energy all around the United States, thank you, California, then in fact, we think that they'll meet those targets earlier. So you lead by example. And the last thing I want to talk about in this opening about why set these targets, what can you do, how do states do it? Well, in the fossil fuel industry, we're making sure that they're, as you said, part of those changes. We expect them to clean up. We're going to do methane emission regulations. We are doing produced water so that we're recycling our water. We want to make sure that we clean up the industry at its source, that we take methane, which is as you know, arguably the worst of our greenhouse gas emissions, and we make them pivot to renewable energy as companies. You do all of those things, and you can create a brand new business and climate change ecosystem for your states and your countries, and we hope by this effort that we get the entire United States to operate in this exact fashion.
Well, I want to start with a question to you first, and then I'll open it up to everyone. But regarding oil and gas, as you mentioned, you're from a fossil fuel state, and given the science, there is a demand, or have been a lot of demands to ban fracking, to get rid of the internal combustion engine, internationally, et cetera. Are these things that you would support? How do you balance those competing pressures as a governor from a state with a big industry?
Well, and you said it right there. How do you balance it? So we could create a situation where it's a full-on fight, and I can tell you that I would not be the first policymaker not to win that fight in my state. We are the third largest oil and gas producer in the country, and likely to be the second largest fairly soon. New Mexico and Texas combined in a place called the Permian Basin, or areas surrounding this basin, have larger oil and gas holdings than some places in the Middle East. So finding that balance is hard. But this should be hard, and you should have the courage to take it on. So instead of having a debate about fracking, although that's occurring in smaller communities away from some of these oil and gas counties, new ways to do that so that it is less problematic. We're transparent about what we're doing, so I'd like to see salt sludge instead of chemicals, making sure that we're recycling, that if we can utilize the innovation in oil and gas to clean up oil and gas to the largest degree, and instead of having an arm wrestling match, we just pivot to all renewable energy. For us, that's the single best way to address this issue. It's faster, quite frankly, it's cleaner, and we address our energy consumption needs and the sale of energy into renewables so that it becomes a non-issue. And that's how we think is the best way to approach that balancing.
Right. Anyone else is welcome to jump in, or I can, yeah.
Yeah, okay, Justin, thank you. Thank you. It is really, it's really nice to hear all that is happening in cities. It's interesting to see that, IPCC in the next cycle that starts in 2023 already planned for a special report that will address climate change in cities, because it does recognize the importance of cities in both ways, both as a source, but, most importantly, as its potential contribution to reduce emissions at large. It's also very appreciative to see, all the efforts that is being carried out, especially on the from fossil fuel, that corresponds to basically 75% of the global emissions. So we appreciate to see the leadership in that direction of thinking of technologies, thinking of innovation, thinking of partnerships. So it's really stimulating to see that. If you allow me, Justin, I'm looking at the clock.
Oh, yeah.
If you allow me, just to complement something. Yesterday I was in a meeting. Basically, it was a meeting also that engaged oil and gas industries and the way they are, thinking together, a large body of companies to address, the way they are going to produce and deliver and continue their business. And then one of the interventions there was, everybody was talking about 1.5. And that was really, really impressive. Oil and gas companies talking about their goal of meeting the 1.5, going carbon neutral, setting the timings of 2030, 2050. But then at some point, one of the CEOs said, yes, but let's not forget that we have different pathways that can lead us, to limit warming to 1.5 at the end of the century. Well, yes, indeed. The IPCC shows a range of potential ways that you can get to 1.5. However, I told him, but there are different implications depending on how you are going to get there. And these implications, for instance, if we need to, as has been said, in 2050 for the net zero emission CO2, obviously it's going to be very hard because for some of the sectors, you're going to have residual CO2 and you will need to have negative emissions balancing that. However, if you go, as we call them, overshoot pathways, which means that you're going to go beyond 1.5 before 2100, and then you have to pull it down to 1.5, depending on the duration of this overshoot, depending on how high you go beyond 1.5. Possibly, we will need to use technologies that are still unproven. Large scale reforestation, as everybody's been saying, large scale bioenergy producing. So we're going to have different routes. and others that we know very little, like solar radiation modification, also in parallel with the carbon dioxide removal techniques and measures. So we have to have in mind that is, yes, indeed. But the earlier we start, I think the easier it's going to be for us to reach the 1.5 in a smoother way and without having to rely on technologies, on measures that, at the moment are scientifically unproven. Right. So it's nice to see that everybody's starting, doing a lot. Right. And this is a good hope for the scientists. Thank you.
Yeah. Are you wanting to add?
Our experience from Copenhagen is that this green transformation for the cities goes hand in hand with good economy, more livability, and to look at Ørsted is a very good example for a company who has transformed from coal and oil to renewable. Ørsted is much more valuable company today after this transformation of Ørsted, and we can see the same for the city, that this transformation goes hand in hand with job creation for a lot of young people and also with a good economy for the citizens. So I think that's a very important message to the heads of states, that don't be afraid, just act, because it's also good for the economy.
Yeah, definitely.
And I just want to add, and I know I don't want to steal everyone's thunder, but the other thing that states have done poorly here is when you make this transition, even though you can make the case for careers and jobs and a growing workforce in renewables and any number of innovations that have both addressed climate change and produce the energy that we need and consume every day, that in that shift there are workers who aren't mining coal and aren't working at coal-powered plants, and that's also true in our state. And in fact, retrofitting these plants to meet the current environmental standards is impossible anymore financially, and it doesn't really work. So we've got 1,000 workers in one very poor county are going to lose their jobs as we transition in this whole transformation. The majority of them are Native American, they're Navajo workers, some of the hardest workers to retrain and place for any number of both cultural and just limited economic opportunities. So we've got an equity fund. It's $40 million. $20 million goes into the cities and the counties so that they can do economic development, that they're really clear about making that effort. And $20 million goes right to the workers. And it's not just training. And while training is critical and education and career support, somebody has to pay the mortgage. So like a severance package, you have to make sure that you don't leave workers behind. And so in Kentucky, in too many of our coal mining states, we just walked away from those workers. So we created a battle in those states about whether it's about an individual's current ability to support their families or whether or not we're going to have a world that we can all inhabit. Why don't you do both? Why don't you protect those families and those workers, have them part of those solutions, and make sure that we have a world that we can all inhabit? So that's an effort that we've taken in our state. We think it's a bold leadership move and feel very confident that it allows us, without interruption, to meet our targets and milestones as a result.
Commissioner Seggos, I'd like to ask, sort of as in relation to that, given the speed of the transition that New York is planning, thinking forward to 2030, how do you address some of those transition and equity issues?
Well, it has to happen all at the same time, right? We have to make the commitments to offshore wind. We have to make the commitments to solar. We have to make the commitments all across the board, recognizing, even bringing on new technologies like heat pumps that are maybe practiced in Europe more regularly, but not so frequently here in New York. How do you do the job training, which is a crucial component of what we see as a major growth industry here in New York? How do you transition the economy outside of the energy sector even to pick up some of the jobs that are being lost? We are fortunate in that we don't have coal mining here in New York. We didn't have much of an oil and gas industry, at least not in many years. So those jobs that we're looking to transition are more to the service side, to the energy efficiency side, which are huge growth opportunities. In fact, the number one growing portion of our job sector from an energy perspective right now is on the energy efficiency side. Less sexy, but very important, making all those retrofits, doing all those installations, training people on new technology is really important. Our SUNY program, SUNY school system here in New York, we've been relying upon them to help to generate some educational curriculum on that program, and then backing it up with state funding. So we have an enormous task ahead of us by 2030 to make sure we're not leaving anybody behind. The governor's talked about this repeatedly since he took office, before we even started talking about this new legislation. We have, to have a strong economy, you have to have a clean environment. And it's the exact other way around as well. For you need a strong economy to justify the environmental spending that we're doing. We've put more money into the environment in the last 8 years than in the prior 30 years in New York. But we're not anywhere near where we need to be, which is why we set this ambitious goals by 2030, 2040, 2050. And moving really the state and bringing everyone along for the ride is going to be crucially important.
Great. I think I'm trying to make sure I get the time right. I think we are just about out of time. Right, okay. So please give a round of applause for the panelists. It's great hearing from them all.
It's nice to meet you.
Governor, great job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Interesting meeting you.
I'm thinking about bike riding. Only
Yeah.
we have
Thank you.
commuters that go 70 miles one way. And
Yeah, I know.
Thank you, Governor. That was great. Thank you. Thanks so much. Great. Okay. We have a little set change. Hi, I'm Amy Davidson. I'm the Executive Director for the Climate Group for North America. I don't know if you guys can hear me. So thank you to that last panel. Thank you to Justin for moderating it. So we were hearing about the vision for 2030. Now we're going to dial it up a little bit and talk about what do we need to do by 2025. What? You can't hear? Interesting. Okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So if I don't talk quite as loud, it's better? Okay. Thank you. So what do we need to do by 2025? And I think about 2025, I feel like I'm actually looking at my clock. I mean, it's only my watch. It's only 5 years away. So quite a bit. So we're going to change this session around and use the Pecha Kucha style. So what that is, we're going to have 4 speakers, and each of them will have 20 slides each and 20 seconds for each slide. So it's going to go really quickly, and they don't get to control their slides. So it's going to be fun, and it's going to be fast. Okay, so the first speaker coming up is going to be Andy Wales. So there you are, Andy. Thank you. Andy is the Chief Digital Impact and Sustainability Officer for BT. BT is one of the world's largest communications company. It's also a wonderful sponsor of today's session and also an RE100 member. So Andy's going first.
I might just hold this as a prop, even though I have absolutely no control. So, I've got 6 minutes, 40 seconds to inspire you, but essentially I just want to ask you 2 questions, which is, who can you be bolder with, and how much bolder can you be together? So BT is a global telco. I'm going to particularly talk about what we do in the UK today. We've been on a climate journey since 1992, when we started measuring and then reporting our carbon dioxide emissions. And like many of you in the room, we've been on a journey together. And I think what's most important is that some of us can demonstrate that this can be done, right? So we're the largest broadband, the largest mobile network in the UK, the largest fixed network. We use about 1% of UK power. That's 2.2 terawatt hours a year, roughly. 100% of that is renewable. And so we're excited about the fact it can be done and also looking forwards. And one of the big opportunities is this, 2030. We think that emissions can be reduced at least 20% by the new tech that's coming in. And that's for a range of reasons, despite the level of data growth that we're all going to see. And so partly because of this, which is 5G, this is us getting down with the kids at Glastonbury Festival, making that 5G in June. But we think we can get 5G to about 10% of the power use for the same data as 4G. And so even as we dramatically grow data use in IoT, in smart homes, in smart cities, actually the change in terms of efficiency is going to be very dramatic. And so I want to ask as we reflect ourselves, for you, particularly the companies in the room, what are 3 things you could do? And the first, of course, is set bold targets. We started back in '92. In 2008, we set one of the world's first science-based targets to reduce emissions by 80% by 2020. We got there 4 years early in 2016. It saved us roughly £300 million. And that's on the back of that, we then set a more ambitious 2030 target. And this time last year, 2045, we set a net zero ambition. And net to 2045, we think the climate journey for BT will save us money, despite some of the investments I'll talk about in a second that we have to make because of what energy efficiency can do. And of course, all of you in the room know how important the collaborations are on this. The RE100 helped us be bolder, stretch our thinking a bit more, and help think through how we did that best. And the next challenge for us in particular is EVs, and that's why EV100 is so important for us. And if you're not involved in that, I'd recommend that you join. The second thing we've done is drive quite a lot of change through the value chain. And that's really about helping our suppliers be bolder, thinking more ambitious about what they can do, and then being a bit hard-nosed about it, actually building it into our supplier contracts, some of our big network providers, as well as those who provide some of the products that we use and our consumers use in their homes. And so it's about challenging, this is a home Wi-Fi hub, to design in a different way with dramatically less materials, dramatically more energy efficient, dramatically less packaging. And so we are taking that systematically through our supply chain and having some quite big expectations for some of those suppliers. But the other big chunk of our emissions, apart from suppliers and our own, is upfront, at the front end with our customers. And so our ambition there is to reduce our customers' emissions by 3 times our own end-to-end emissions by next year, by 2020, on that 2016 base. And we're nearly there. And that's partly about things like high-quality video conferencing replacing travel, telematics, encouraging better driving habits. And there's a whole range of creative things in there, but also some outside carbon. So this is an in-link data point. It's for kind of free community telco and Wi-Fi. You can see them around New York streets. We also have them across the UK. In Birmingham and Bradford, we're using them to give real-time air quality data to the local councils so they can monitor air quality across the city. We're also working with different suppliers of products like bike lights, this is Manchester, to be able to map bike routes and where cyclists are going and give feedback on some of the journey times and how things are working so that they can improve cycle management across the city. So it's about, I think, thinking creatively about how you can engage with and how you can partner with them to find bolder solutions for the kind of lifestyle changes that we're going to need to see. And so my question for you is who can you influence? If you think not just in your obvious sphere within your business, but your partners across your entire value chain, how can you challenge them to think as creatively as possible, as boldly as possible, and in a way, of course, that generates better economic returns for them as well as for you? And then the third thing, of course, we're beginning to run into now is the need to transform systems. The big knotty problems that can only be solved by companies and states and local authorities and universities and others all working together. And for BT, the biggest challenge of those is EVs. So the big chunk of our emissions left to deliver, because I agree with Adair Turner that we shouldn't use offsets as far as possible, is around EVs. We have around 30,000 vehicles on the road across the UK the whole time, engineers managing the mobile and broadband networks and helping in people's homes. The electric vehicles that they need, the replacement vehicles, aren't yet ready. They won't yet be ready for 18 to 24 months. We're obviously trying to pull them forward as fast as we can, the scale of van we need. And so we need to work hard on that. But the bigger challenge is the overall infrastructure. So most of those 30,000 vans sleep on the street. They live outside our engineers' houses. And so we need to be part of a much bigger solution to accelerating the move to EV infrastructure across the UK. And that's about street furniture, lampposts, and our network cabinets and our payphones, and any possible opportunity to work in a much more ambitious way to move towards, we're some way from this utopia here of electric vehicle charging in the UK, and that's a big challenge. So this week together, all of us here in New York, how is it that we can start to challenge each other a bit more and ask each other some questions about how we can be bolder? And one of the ideas I like in that, and Gabrielle Gina, who's just over here, who runs sustainability for BT, one of her big, the things we often talk about within the business is an ambition loop. How can we start to use ambition loops to work with different stakeholders out in our value chain and more broadly to start to challenge our thinking and think in a bigger way, including as we do our kind of business development thinking and planning? And that's where I think we have a really good example in the UK in the form of the net zero target for 2050 that we set earlier in the summer. And we were the first advanced economy to put it into law. And if you've seen the news this morning, the rule of law is quite an important part of the UK at the moment. And so having this there, as part of a collaboration between, government and companies and others willing to do this together, I think is a good sign of how far we can go. And so I guess my challenge for you is this: how can you be bolder, and who can you do it with? On Friday, I was in London at the climate strike with my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old. And of course, I'm sure many of us saw either the video or live Greta yesterday talking. And I don't think we have much option to do anything other than be bolder. And so my question is, with whom and how are you going to do it? Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That was brilliant. I mean, it's definitely what we need to do, is be much, much bolder in these very short 5 years. So our next speaker will be Mafalda. Duarte. Is Mafalda? There you are. There, thank you. Good. And she heads up the climate investment funds, which of course lowers risks and also capital costs, to make sure that we have a great new climate investments, such as the concentrated solar power in Morocco. So thank you.
Very good. Can you replay it? I think it's jumped. All right. Okay, perspective from developing countries now. Yes, we are in a climate crisis. The number of floods and heavy rains has quadrupled since 1980. And extreme temperatures, droughts, and wildfires have more than doubled in the last 40 years. Pay attention to these numbers. 800 million people, maybe I do this and this, 800 million people currently vulnerable to climate change impacts. With current plans, we are heading to a rise in global temperatures of 2.9 to 3.4 degrees by 2100. Carbon emissions from energy use are rising at the fastest rate since 2011, and we are losing 30 football pitches of forests every minute, 200 of those by the end of this short presentation. Yes, we need to do a lot more, and yes, we are running out of time. IPCC says 11 years to embrace far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and industrial systems. And the next 2 or 3 years will be decisive to shift these systems to avoid carbon and climate vulnerability lock-in for decades to come. Having said that, I always like to focus my message on hope. As you know, a challenge is an opportunity in disguise, so we actually need to seize this moment to radically transform the way we conceive and deliver development and prosperity. We should actually welcome this crisis, because it might finally mean making the tough decisions that are long overdue. I'm a development professional. I reoriented my career 13 years ago to focus on climate action, and these are the 13 years that give me hope. In 2008, the international community came together to establish these funds. This was 2008, the height of one of the worst financial crises in history, and where we were behind reaching a climate agreement. These founding countries showed real leadership. This was the first attempt to dedicate significant resources to support developing countries taking climate action, $8 billion worth of resources. And in just 10 years, we've been able to support 72 countries and scale up their investments, and are on track to reach these results. 26.5 gigawatt of renewable energy, more than the total power capacity of Vietnam and almost the same as Netherlands. 8.5 million people with improved access to energy, equivalent of the population of Switzerland or Sierra Leone. 36 million hectares of forests under improved management, the equivalent of the area of Congo or Germany. And 45 million people supported to cope with the impacts of climate change. This is more than the population of Argentina or Sudan. These are very good results. Not enough, but very good. We owe these results to a business model that I keep hearing more and more now, which gives me hope, that pioneered an investment approach beyond business as usual. The project-by-project finance that we are still the prevailing way of doing business will not get us to where we need to be. We need to focus on the outset on delivering transformation. How do we do this? We need to provide scaled-up finance and require coherent investment packages that mobilize the best technical and financial capacity of all partners involved. And now we know that it led to real impact, not just in terms of changing systems, but most importantly, changing people's lives. This is Kenneth. I met him. He's a 26-year-old young boy from Ghana. He had planned to get on a boat and cross the Mediterranean Sea, trying to reach Spain, knowing very well all of the risks, but is now instead embarking on his sustainable cocoa farm on the footsteps of his grandmother. This is Jeanette from Chile. I met her as well, who has finally 24/7 access to energy, and since then she opened a laundry business, is now earning her degree online, finally owns a fridge for her food and a heater for her home, and feels safe in the knowledge that she can reach a doctor if her kids get sick at night. She couldn't do this before. So when we reach these key development objectives while meeting our climate goals, I gained a renewed belief that we can transform societies. We are doing it. I was asked to touch on subnational action and private sector. Why is subnational action so important? Urban population will grow by nearly 1 billion people in the next decade. And by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in cities. Trillions of dollars will be invested in urban infrastructure. By 2030, that figure can amount to 92 trillion. To avoid the lock-in situations, this infrastructure needs to be built in a sustainable and climate-friendly manner. Subnational leaders, some of which we saw this morning, are on the front lines of our response to climate challenge. And we need to help them because in developing countries, certainly, they are very often constrained by lack of financial resources and technical capability. Why is the private sector so important? Because it holds the know-how, the innovation, and the trillions of dollars in finance that we need to get this agenda moving. Institutional investors have an estimated $111 trillion under management, less than 3% of this invested in infrastructure, even less in developing countries. So what is needed? A level of imagination, believe me, a level of imagination that helps us move away from our preconceived models of delivering policy, investments, and development. We are operating under preconceived models. We need levels of determination and sustained commitment that we have not yet seen to stay on track and overcome barriers. We need to mobilize action from across all levels through powerful stories like the VR this morning, information data, through technology, because that will help us monitor the change around us, empower local solutions and local action, and support accountability from governments and private sector, and through investments that deliver returns, but also and especially social impact. We are behind these goals. We expect to launch 4 new programs early next year, one on climate-smart urbanization. This is to support at least 20 small to medium-sized cities in developing countries test and implement new urban development investment approaches. We plan to launch a program to accelerate transition in carbon-intensive industries, including some of which mentioned this morning, chemicals, petrochemicals, iron and steel, and aluminum manufacturing, a renewable energy integration program to demonstrate at scale the integration of high volume of renewable energy into our power systems, and a landscapes program to support integrated natural resource management solutions. So I look forward to working with you all and all of those out there to take our ambition to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Mafalda. I mean, it's obviously financing is absolutely key, and there's going to be a session later on this afternoon about sustainable financing. So our next speaker now is the former mayor of Vancouver, a beautiful city, for anybody who has been there. So Gregor Robertson, and now Gregor, nice to welcome you. He's now the ambassador for the Global Covenant of Mayors at Climate and Energy. So thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to start with a visual image that doesn't impact a lot of us directly. As a mayor of Vancouver, the hurricanes in the Caribbean did not affect us directly, and climate change may seem abstract to a lot of people. It doesn't affect their daily lives, but because of their geography, because of their work, maybe it's because of their worldview, but it isn't front and center. And that's the most unfortunate thing here. Not enough people are as aware and dialed in and as affected right now as they need to be, because climate change is having devastating effects around the world. We've all seen in this room, I'm sure we've all seen the impacts playing out, and you'll see all kinds of slides about this momentarily. Or we could just hover above the Earth like astronauts for a little bit longer. So we are seeing on a daily basis devastation at a community level. There are so many millions of people around the world impacted by this, and I want to speak to the impacts at a local level. This is where mayors are involved. This is where we lead our communities through thick and thin, and where we see the chaos hitting home. Since I was a kid, and we just heard this, it's 3 times the number of climate disasters impacting us and our communities. And we are seeing massive costs that are affecting us at a local level as well, rolling up to a global level, staggering costs of these climate impacts, economically and with human lives and displacement and tragedy. It's the #1 threat to world security, to public health, and to the global economy. And all that starts and finishes at a local level. But shockingly, we have seen emissions and fossil fuel use increase since Paris. It's outpacing the growth of renewable energy. There's good news with renewable energy, but the bad news is fossil fuels continue to outpace renewables. We thought that was a trend that was going to shift, and it has not yet. And the impacts we're seeing again on the ground in cities with air quality is a particular problem. The World Health Organization tells us 4.2 million people die annually because of air pollution. 91% of us on this planet live in air quality that exceeds healthy guidelines. So where are we seeing leadership on this? I've been part of Mayors for Climate since its inception, just after Paris. We are not superheroes by any stretch. I wish we had superheroes coming to the rescue and making all this change a lot faster. But cities are proving that changes can happen at the local level. And cities and states, subnational governments. I'm going to focus on the city side of this because we've seen remarkable results in cities. Copenhagen, we heard from the mayor here about the work that they've done there. We've seen air pollution in places like LA that was once shockingly bad has started to change. We're seeing regions organize on the West Coast from LA to Vancouver. The Pacific Coast Collaborative is organizing the cities and the states and province to work together. We're seeing it in the north of Africa. We're seeing Global Covenant active in Europe as well, bringing cities together to work together at a regional scale where we can have real impact. 1,000 cities have declared a climate emergency now, more than 1,000 cities, and that leads to direct action that we're taking. Hundreds of cities have committed to to 100% renewable. That commitment, carbon buildings, compact communities. We're seeing great leadership as well in the business community. We're seeing tasty low-carbon food. We're seeing renewable energy is scaling in many places. So there's huge leadership happening in the business community as well as at the local level in cities. Solutions are scaling up. So we come back to collaboration again, and that's where those of us on the front lines, those who have to deliver on a daily basis, who have to look after our communities and provide goods and services, we have to work better together. The collaboration has to deepen and strengthen and make sure that we are making the transformation that we need. A good example of this, and we've seen dramatic changes in cities from New York to Copenhagen, around the world with clean transportation, whether that's bicycles or electric bicycles, whether it's electric or zero-emission buses. We're seeing public-private partnerships deliver solutions in transportation. Obviously, we need much more scale to this. But it's not getting better. The situation is not getting better, and that's, I think, to point fingers, we have to start with national governments who have made very clear commitments in Paris, who have put words on the line and are not delivering with actions. We are seeing promises, and it's not just Trump or Bolsonaro. Almost all of the largest governments in the world, the national governments, they are delivering for the fossil fuel industry. $5.2 trillion in subsidies last year. That's where our money is going, our public money is going. So there is delivery happening. It continues to happen to an industry that has put our planet in peril. Surely we're at a tipping point. Millions of our children are now leading the civil disobedience to point out the problem. We've been awoken by our kids for the right reasons. And we have unprecedented impacts at local levels. The impacts from Mozambique to Bahamas, I don't need to continue to speak to that. There is a clear way forward. We have the solutions among us. We know this as cities. We know this as business. The solutions are there. The report just released at the UN this last few days that we have 90% of our emissions in cities. We have the technology. We know what to do. We know what policies to implement. But we absolutely need solutions delivered by national governments. We need that action. National governments and financial industry need to step up to the plate here. New tools for climate finance are critical to finance this transition, reduce climate pollution, and that starts in our cities where we can roll it out. Across the world now, there are over 10,000 cities that are part of Mayors for Climate. The mayors willing to lead on this and making clear, transparent commitments. With RE100, we've seen hundreds of companies committing to going 100% renewable. So we've got incredible partnership possibilities and collaboration. We can deliver this. We need to collaborate more deeply, and we need to put more pressure on our national governments and our financial institutions to make sure we have the investment and the support necessary to take action and solve this. Thank you.
So super. So we have one last speaker. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Elena Zaldibar, who's the Deputy Minister of Environment for the Basque Country. And the Basque Country is one of the leading regions in the Under 2 Coalition, which the Climate Group runs, which is a network of over 200 subnational governments committed to deep decarbonization. And Elena is a scientist by background, so please come join us.
Thank you. Good morning. And Kaixo. Here's hello in our language, the Basque. First of all, I would like to thank the Climate Group for giving us this opportunity, the opportunity to the region to speak together with the nation and together with the cities. The Basque Country is an example of a region with authority in the development of environmental policies which should be heard. Our history is an history from an industrial model. We have our rivers, land, and air highly polluted, and in a short period of time, we can change to a territory with good environmental quality. We are a small European region, perhaps not even the size of a neighborhood of New York, but we have a GDP per capita comparable to that of Germany, a region with its own institution highly industrialized and well connected that is located between the sea and the mountains. And we can prove that it's possible to grow economically, will improve the environmental indices. The Basque Country revolves around 3 small cities, each of one has its personality, but united by the commitment to the environment. And it's not my opinion. The recent international awards are proof of this. In 1977, Bilbao had the dubious honor to be the most polluted city in Spain. Today, our environmental values are on a par with the best environmental standard. But the Basque Country is an ancient land with deep roots and responsibility for our history. We are proud of the country we have inherited and are committed to preserving it to the future generations. The Basque Country Agenda 2030 is our main policies. We have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals as inspiration for the Basque welfare model. We have made gender equality, social justice, and of course, climate emergency key points in the Basque policy. But we don't start yesterday. Back in 2000, the Basque Country approved its Sustainable Development Environmental Strategy. And since then, we have established careful planning that addresses all aspects that can be adopted to face the challenge of climate change, about the energy, the water, the transition. The Climate 2050 strategy was approved in 2015, even before the signing of the Paris Agreement, and lays out our roadmap to major targets, 9 goals, 70 actions, and the main issues are our industrial reality, the emission derived from transport, and our energy dependence. We have reduced greenhouse gas emission by 22% in the last feature of 2017. And our industry had made a great deal for introduce a new technology and reduce its emission, and we are on course to fulfill our objective of a 40% by 2030. But the main challenge for us is to reduce the emission of the transport. And our paradox is that we are a region with innovative solutions in electrification of this sector. But just important to improve the reduction of emission is to improve the resilience of our territory, because the 70% of the Basque population live on the coast, and for us, we are now living the consequence of the climate change. How are we doing this? It is not enough to do different things. We need to do things differently. Our economy needs to import 70% of raw materials, and it's for that the circular economy is a must for the Basque Country in the fight against climate change. A circular economy based on eco-design and eco-innovation. Within circular, we have introduced the circular thinking movement to stimulate innovation in industry and to consume fewer materials and energy, generating less waste. But also, the public-private collaboration is in our DNA. That means working together with companies, research centers, and universities. The Basque Eco-Design Center, an alliance of the most important companies today, is a reference in terms of eco-design in Europe. But also, the soul of companies are the people. Skills and training are a key factor in this change of model. We have been training the professionals of the future for almost 20 years, and they are now the present. The eco-design and eco-innovation are implemented into the core of companies by trained persons, and this is very important. But we have mentioned the public-private collaboration, but public collaboration is also crucial. The local action is vital for that. 20 years ago, we created a network of sustainable municipality, Alexandria 2030, and more than 200 municipalities working together for integrate the sustainable development goals in local policies. But what is the role of citizens? For us, we know that the Basque population is extremely aware of climate change, but they say that don't know how to act. It's for that that last March we organized the International Climate Change Conference, and we put the climate change in the agenda of media and in the conversation of citizens. It's true, the role of citizens is crucial, and it's vital to introduce a change in habits in our daily life. It shapes to count, no matter how small it might be. Last July, the Basque Country declared the state of climate emergency, placing the fight against the climate change as a key country target. Our ambition is to make the Basque Country carbon neutral by 2050 or before. There is no time to be lost. The Basques are people of honor. You can count on the Basque Country, and the Basque Country count on you. Thank you a lot.
We are probably looking for our next speaker, but as we're doing that, thank you so much. Thank you for all of our Pecha Kucha speakers. I mean, we heard about being bold, which we all need. We heard a lot about hope, because there's so many solutions that are out there, but we need to just implement them faster, as we've been talking about. And obviously we heard about the circular economy, the ambition loop, all of those things, and I think so my quote and my thought goes to what Mafalda said, is that we need a new level of imagination if we're going to get to where we need to be by both 2025, but of course by 2030. So I'm delighted to introduce the next speaker, although she may be missing. So just give us a second here. Alexandria, because I don't see you here. So I think we're going to be looking for her just a little bit. What? Okay, so we're going to move to the panel next, and then hopefully she will show up afterwards. So thank you. Yes, because yeah, if you can.
Thanks, everyone. So now we're going to introduce our next panel, Setting a Path to Success, What Needs to be Done by 2020. And it's a sort of weird, I'm going to shuffle backwards because I'm actually on this panel, and introduce, first of all, Emily Atkin to come and moderate this session.
This should be fun.
Hey, I'll sit. My name's Emily Atkin. I am a climate contributing writer to The New Republic. I write a daily newsletter for climate news called Heated. I'm here to moderate this panel on what we do by the year 2020, which is soon. It's a hard topic, but we have some cool panelists here who I think will shed some light on the subject and make it interesting for us. So first we have Jesper Brodin. He's the CEO of Inca Group, which is formerly IKEA. We have Mustafa Santiago Ali, he's the VP for Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization at the National Wildlife Federation. We have Mike Cannon-Brooks. He's the co-founder and co-CEO of Atlassian. We have Helen Clarkson, the CEO of the Climate Group. And we have Wade Crowford, who is the Secretary for Natural Resources for California. We were going to have former Governor Jerry Brown, but he couldn't make it. So we have Wade, and I think that's great, because Wade is in the California government and can tell us a bit of how that's working. So thanks, everyone, for being here. Yeah, let's give a round for the panel, yeah? All right, so today we've heard about what needs to be done in the next decade, and it's really hard stuff, sometimes uncomfortable stuff. It means, reducing things like fossil fuel use, even things like consumerism. So it's easy to I feel like it's much easier to talk about what has to happen in the next 10 years rather than what do we need to do in the next 3 months? And it's actually a question that I get all the time, which is, okay, I get that I need to do this, but what do I do tomorrow? And so I guess the first thing that I would love to ask Jesper, from your perspective, what really needs to be on the to-do list for companies this year, next month, within the next year? What's the priority?
That's a big question. Yeah, no, but I think I love, by the way, that we're here talking about 2020 and here and now. In a way, it's interesting with time because sometimes we need the perspective to dare to commit and to think about how the future needs to look like. But when we've done that, when we committed, I think it's all about bringing it back to say what's stopping us from doing things today. So what I think to your question, what companies need to do, to start with, we need to commit even if we don't have all the plans, which is a bit untraditional. You want to be secure that you have all the facts on the table before you commit. But in this case, with the urgency of the situation, we need to do the opposite. And then I think it is about rolling up the sleeves and get moving. It's good to be in discussions on intentions, to put words behind what we do. But in the end of the day, it's actions that's going to make things work. So that's what we need to do.
Mustafa, I want to ask you basically the same question, but I know that you used to be at the EPA, in the federal government, working in our bureaucracy, environmental organizations. But I'm interested to hear your perspective on government action. What can be done in government in the period of a year?
Well, I think there are a number of different things that we need to do. So we have to remember that our governments are supposed to actually be about and from the people. So I think that that's where we need to start because there is a disconnect with what's going on. I'm a part for the last, 25, 26 years doing this work. And we often forget about vulnerable communities and their relationship to their governments, both on the local, the county, the state, and the federal level. And then we could even go into the international if we had to. So we're not willing to address the disparities that are happening in those relationships. Then we're never going to get to the goals that we're talking about. So one, we need to make sure that people are voting. We need to make sure that people actually have access and be able to participate in that, because they can help us to make sure that the right people are in place, make sure that the right structures are in place, and the change that needs to happen can actually be put into motion, if you will. On the government side, there are a number of things. So if you look at some of the commitments or lack thereof from a number of countries around the planet, if you look at their democracy and see if that is actually playing out or the lack thereof, that sends a strong signal. So let's stay here in the United States just for a moment. So if we're truly going to address the issues that are in front of us and that are happening at this time, then we also need to make sure that there is real authentic, collaborative actions that are happening on the federal level. And that means that we need to have individuals who are a part of our departments and our administrations, that are all coordinating in this space. And that's the only way that we're actually going to be able to hit some of these numbers that are necessary. But if I can take it just one step further.
Do it.
So we have a problem. So for the last 40 years, folks of color have been trying to get people's attention to say that these coal-fired power plants, these petrochemical facilities, these refineries are being located in our communities. They're being located in places like Port Arthur, Texas, in a Manchester community in Houston, Texas. They're being, all across the Gulf Coast. These coal-fired power plants are being placed in those communities. And I'm sorry, I just believe in real talk. People didn't want to pay attention when it was people of color who were being impacted from these things. We got 100 to 200,000 people who are dying prematurely every year in this country from air pollution. We got 25 million people who have asthma in this country, 7 million kids, and disproportionately as African Americans and Latinos who are the ones who are going to the emergency rooms and the ones who are losing their lives. So we are not willing to address the infrastructure that is being placed inside of these communities and making them sacrifice zones. How can we convince them that they need to be a part of this climate army that we're trying to put together to address these issues? If we are not willing to address the pipelines that are running disproportionately across indigenous lands and lower income communities' lands and landing again in those communities that I just referenced, how can we convince them to be a part of this movement? Now, some are, but if we're really going to win on this, then that means we're going to need all of those. And that goes back to your question about the government. So the government has some responsibility in that space. One, to make sure that we're having the right types of laws and statutes that are in place and they're being fully implemented in all of the communities and not some of the communities. And they also have a responsibility, because they're using people's tax dollars, to make sure that they're not polluting them and that those policies, that there's actually access points for those communities. So those are just a couple of the things that I think would be helpful.
I think that's a great answer. And actually, Wade, I want to ask you, because you are the Secretary for Natural Resources Agency in California. California has for a long time been a leader, absolute leader in climate policies, but also at the same time on supply side, extraction. There's been a lot of oil extraction in California. And a lot of times, a lot of the oil extraction is in Kern County, which is a disproportionately Latino county. What can be done in the next year to, ensure what Mustafa is saying, that these communities can be engaged when they are surrounded by extraction? What is California doing?
Well, first of all, I would just agree with Mustafa that the legacy of environmental pollution in the U.S. and in our own state of California has burdened communities of color, period. And unless and until we actually address that, we're not going to be successful in the climate movement. I'm proud to be from a state that's investing almost half of its climate revenues back into disadvantaged communities, recognizing the historic burden. I think a state like California needs to continue to lead on the demand side in terms of reducing our demand for fossil fuels, but then also think into the future around how we manage the decline of fossil fuel. About 30% of the gasoline that we use in California is produced in California, is extracted in California. California is actually like the 5th or 6th largest oil-producing state in the country. Not a lot of people know that. And so we're actually developing essentially a long-term pathway to manage down the supply of oil that's extracted in California as our demand declines. Because it's not only about demand, it's about demand and supply.
And in the next year, I know that's a long-term pathway, but what does that look like in a year?
Well, it looks like, first of all, really working with burdened communities. You talked about Kern County, which is a rural county in California. I was down there 2 weeks ago, working with those communities to better protect health and safety. The fact is that these extractive industries continue to disproportionately impact communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities. So it likely means strengthening health and safety protections, and which obviously may or may not have impact on the supply. But then it's really thinking about a thoughtful, proactive pathway to manage supply, because it can't just be all about demand.
Right. So it sounds like a key thing to do that we're hearing is getting communities who are affected engaged. That's a priority for the next year. And Mike, you are the co-CEO of Atlassian tech company. Big tech, is engaged on the issue of climate change as well. At the same time, I feel like big tech companies really like to say they're doing a lot with climate change, but there's a lot of criticism out there that they could be doing a lot more. And so I want to know what you think about that. What can big tech companies be doing that they're not currently doing in the next year?
Look, I think big tech companies probably are, if you look at a spectrum of companies, on the towards the good end of the spectrum. I mean, we have some unfair advantages. We don't generally have chemical pollutants and other things going out. Largely, it's data centers and running costs, and that turns out we have most of the scientific solutions to most of that issue. I think the biggest thing that tech companies can do in the next 12 months, particularly, like what we've done, is making, firstly, the commitments. As Jesper said, you can make these commitments without having that plan entirely in place. So we've done that both with RE100 in terms of moving to 100% renewable energy, and then also recently with the new UN business step up towards 1.5 degrees and looking at being science-based targets for totally net zero by 2050. I think a lot of businesses can start to make those commitments in the next 12 months. The second thing they can do is then get their employee bases activated in helping to solve those problems, right? It's been really inspiring to see internally our staff saying, we say we don't have all these answers, but we have to go here. Help us get there, rather than it being a sort of a battle, because that actually, it turns them into like lots and lots of little climate warriors around the business, right? They're finding problems and solving them, and you can do that inside a year. Thirdly, on the company side, I think collaborating with other companies to say, how are you solving this and how are we solving it? That instantly makes you feel a bit less scared about other people have other solutions. I think you can do all that as a company inside of a year, and then you're taking the first step, right, and then other groups are kind of going on from that. If I might add, I totally agree with what Mustafa said, but I'll take a different lens. Firstly, let me apologise for Australia on behalf of all the Australians in the audience. So, I wanted to tie into one of the things that you said at the end there. So we're 10%, more than 10% of the world's emissions we export or generate ourselves, right? This is a staggering number that most Australians are not aware of or would not acknowledge, right? So what else can you do inside of a year? You talked about acknowledging, hey, we put these things in these places. This has had this effect. I think in under a year, you can acknowledge the realities of what is actually happening, which is almost a first step to starting to solve it, right? We as Australia need to acknowledge we export 10% of the world's emissions. We have 25 million people. That's crazy. What can we do in under a year? We can't change that. This is long-term industries and oil and gas and all sorts of other things, sure. But inside a year, we can acknowledge that's a problem. We have an issue. We need a plan to go solve it, right? You can do that inside a year. That acknowledgement starts with then a process of moving forward. I think that's an important step.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of this has to do with personal accountability for your industry, for your company, for your country, for your government. Helen, you work with a lot of companies, encouraging them to be more climate responsible. What are we missing so far in the beginning of this conversation? Real opportunities that are just being missed?
Well, I think one thing we haven't talked about is what's the significance kind of at the international level of the next year, which is that under the Paris Agreement, so the Quick Paris Primer signed in 2015, in that process, each country has to make their own commitments called a nationally determined contribution. Those have been set, but they come back next year for revision. And so at the end of next year, it will be happening in the UK, the Conference of the Parties come together, and at that point, we need all the countries in the world to ratchet up their level of ambition. And so next year is absolutely critical at that kind of international framing level. And this is where I think we haven't quite talked about how all the different stakeholders need to be putting pressure on their national governments. And we've got a big problem where some of the governments may not be there. Some of the ones that signed Paris, notably the US, don't know if they're going to be there in Glasgow. Very much depends on the election in November next year. And that's where states in particular, like California, are really kind of stepping in and saying, actually, if you add together all the states and all the businesses in the US that are committed, it gets you a long way towards actually hitting those Paris targets and others. So there's a kind of displacement where if the federal government in countries isn't taking it on, we've got to look to other stakeholders to play their role. And I think that's a critical aspect of the next year, is to keep our eye on that sort of macro lens as well.
I know some panelists want to respond. Do we want to just go down and give responses? Mustafa?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the other things that we did not discuss is divestment and reinvestment. So I believe in 2014, we were at about $54 billion at that time. Now we're at $11 trillion. So we have some real opportunities that exist in that space. Also, one in the education, but also in looking at our respective organizations, our governments, to see where they are in alignment with that, to help to have leverage points, to place pressure in the places that it needs to be. So that is just one additional tool, but sometimes we don't talk enough about that. So quick shout out, since I also come from the hip hop world, to Wallace Global and some of the others who are doing some incredible work in that space.
Great. Maybe I can.
Sure.
I'm from the heavy metal world, but it has nothing to do with sustainability. I wanted to say, but it's. I think maybe one thing in combination what we talked about, speaking about, like you said, Mike, put a spotlight on the problem. I think also what we could do much better, and where you can maybe guide us also from Climate Group, is to say, put a spotlight on the solutions that happens. And now this is not about self-fulfillment, but we are today in IKEA, we are already delivering on our target to be by 2025 we're going to have only electric vehicles in home deliveries. It's amazing. But the first cities, Shanghai, is up and running. We have 4 more cities coming in 2020 within the 1 year scope. And so it's not all the way, but it's amazing examples that is actually possible. And I think as much as we need to put spotlight on the problems, we need to fuel all our communities with hope and faith, and switch from problem statements to actually looking at the solution.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say, to your point, we can't wait on national leaders to get it right on climate change. The world can't wait. If you're American or if you're not American, the hostility of the Trump administration to anything related to climate change is terribly discouraging. In our state of California, the Trump administration today is trying to disallow fuel efficiency standards that we've put in place that have saved consumers tens of billions of dollars and reduced emissions. So it's not a case of benign neglect. It's a case of outward hostility. But we can't wait for our national politics to change. And I think that's where this Under 2 MOU comes in. 220 subnationals from across the world, representing 43% of the planet's economy, are pushing as hard as they possibly can this year, next decade, to actually meet the targets that we need to meet. And I'm actually encouraged, because I actually think we're going to move beyond those leaders that are on the wrong side of history. But I think you're right. 2020, I heard termed this week as sort of the super year on climate. So I think anybody in the room, regardless of what you're doing, need to push hard, because 2020 is a pivotal year. And don't be discouraged if the national politics of where you come from don't support the kind of leadership that we need. Fill that leadership vacuum ourselves.
And I think I mean, that was part of the kind of ethos of the Paris Agreement, was switching it around from a lot of the discussions before that had been very sort of finger-pointing and, well, you need to. And the Paris Agreement kind of got over this and said, like, we will if you will. You know, let's all, sorry, not we will if you will, we will, and we will all do it together. We will all do our part. And I do feel in the last few years we've got a bit, you know, I'm getting to hear again from businesses things like, well, you know, what about China? And that's the kind of bogeyman thing which people throw in when they want to, you know, slow things down or say, well, it's not fair, you know. So I think we've got to get that kind of spirit back again about actually this is really a collective effort, and it's not about sitting and sort of pointing over there, but thinking about what do I need to do here. And I think it's really important now, and we've started talking about this more, is to yes, focus on the solutions, and we do that a lot with our campaigns. We bring companies together to learn from one another, and that'll be happening a lot through the hub here today as we have members meetings and learning. But also starting, you know, just sort of poking businesses and reminding them that, you know, I wrote about this last week, creative destruction is not a theoretical bit that you just sort of learn in the first year of economics. It's real. And if you don't get ready for this and get your business ready, actually you're going out of business. And I think we just need to kind of, yes, highlight solutions, yes, show where there's really good things happening, but also remind, you know, all of us that, you know, this is a proper existential threat that's coming for us as humanity and also as the parts that we play within the economy.
I want to take that and jump to the most obvious thing that's happening in the next year that could have a significant impact on climate action and whether we do something, which is the election. I mean, I know this event is supposed to be about what businesses, states, localities can do in that time. However, there's this elephant in the room that there's this national thing that's happening that could really affect how states can or cannot implement carbon policy. We see that in California, or whether or not the national government is going to encourage businesses to be more climate friendly. Right? So I want to pose this question to both you, Jesper, and you, Mike. You know, our business CEOs here. What do you think is the responsibility of CEOs, big multinational corporations, in the next year to be vocal and put their money into the 2020 election in terms of politics?
Well, maybe I can start. I think when it comes to mixing the agenda of sustainability and politics, I think as a corporation I need to reflect before we do that. But if you say, aside that, on the contrary, I think it's important to make the highway of climate free from politics. And then you will disagree maybe too. But I think it's it's something that concerns all of us. We talked about being on the right side of history, and I think we made our choice. And what we're going to do is to try to, the coming year actually, to the 2020, as you described it in a lovely way, which is a great opportunity for us to influence more people. And we're going to provide training for 170,000 colleagues within our company. We're going to add speed to the actions that we do. And that's where we're going to create opinion. Then I understand and have the biggest respect for that. There needs to be political discussions. But then again, we have to represent all our coworkers and all our customers in a way.
I know I just want to follow up. You said you said something about separating politics from climate in the business space. Does that mean that, you know, it's hard for companies to be political voices because of their employees or because of their interests, you know, in other things that aren't climate? I mean,
maybe to say that, I think it's again, we represent, so to say, young, old, left and right in our customer base and in our coworker base. I think we will not be lured into polarization, but rather to find, when there is a topic, we will place ourselves in our opinion and our direction when it comes to climate. And then whether that is political or not, I actually don't know. But again, we're going to be placing ourselves in the actions and the resolutions that needs to come for this to happen. And then I think whatever we can do to speed up, to show that our investments are not only symbolic, but they actually have an impact, then I think that's the best thing we can do.
Mike, do you have an opinion about the role of multinational corporations and whether they should be getting involved more in climate politics?
Look, I have gotten involved. Maybe not multinationally, but look, I think that the challenge here is when you say getting involved in politics, that sounds very deep, in sort of a deep way. I don't think companies should be donating huge amounts of money or those sorts of things. I do think corporate leaders have a responsibility to speak on important issues on behalf of their companies and, in a way that represents those issues. I think there are a lot of very complicated and polarizing issues. I don't think climate should be one of them, right? I loved, for those who didn't see, Greta came and someone asked, what's different about America to Sweden? And she says, what's strange in America is climate is something you believe in or don't believe in. In Sweden, it's a fact. And that's the sort of thing that should come across really clearly from corporate leaders to say, this is a factual issue. This is a problem. We need sensible policy setting so we can make investments. We need corporations to be doing their bit to move things forward, and we need governments to come to the party. I think you can say those things without if that's getting involved deeply in politics, etc. But I think it's incumbent on corporations to be explaining and communicating those issues strongly.
Helen? Yeah, we're talking about the to-do list for next year and sort of following on from this. I think one thing that business leaders can go back to their companies and do is actually just check in what your government affairs departments are up to. We see it all the time that you've got these incredibly progressive companies, but the people in the government affairs are just trained to lobby against stuff. And the two aren't always speaking in alignment. And I think, okay, it sounds simple from the outside, just get that aligned. But, there's often local or state or national level lobbying that could just actually open up your path to being success through what you're doing with some of the things that you're working on, rather than you've just got this group of people sitting in a corner office just fighting against stuff. So I'd add that to the to-do list for the next year.
And I would just add that I think the key partnership between business and government is to really break once and for all this tired paradigm that it's environment versus jobs. It's just not a fact. In California, we're not growing despite climate policies, we're growing because of climate policies. We have five clean energy jobs for every fossil fuel job. We've had the longest streak of minimal unemployment that the state has ever known, while uplifting communities. We have, something like 50% of the clean tech investment coming to California because of our policies. I think with visionary business leaders, standing with political leaders, getting over this tired notion of jobs versus environment, which is a narrative that's going to divide us.
Wait, I kind of want to follow up on that with just asking you how you think state governments, climate-minded governments like California, what can they do in the next year to encourage more responsible action from companies? Is there anything? Are there any bills, policies, regulations, I don't know, that you could see potentially being, having those nice, warm, fuzzy, incentivizing things?
Yeah. Well, I'll say we need policies that squeeze the pollution out of our economy. So it's target setting, but also California has got a really successful cap and trade program that's has delivered billions of dollars back to emission reduction activities, almost half of which have gone to disadvantaged communities. So regulation plays some role, but increasingly it's actually supporting, visionary companies and figuring out how to help them lead. We're lucky in California because we do have tech leadership that has been really supportive, but it's also working with. Yesterday, I was in a lift last night with somebody who works in state government, and he works for an energy efficiency program that helps food processors, and it provides 85% of funding for energy efficiency projects for food processing. And that's a big issue because we have food processors that say they'll leave the state because of environmental regulations. So the question is, regulatory standards have their role, but how to create incentives to help business do the right thing.
Yeah, Mustafa, I wanted to ask you the same question, but also you can respond.
Yeah, so one of the things we have to do is, we're really good at pointing out those who are doing bad or who are doing wrong, but we hardly ever highlight those who are actually trying to be good partners or being good partners and taking it to another level. When I was in the government, one of the things that I did was for those companies that were in communities with environmental injustices that were making, sort of making the turn and starting to do things in a more positive direction, then we created awards, not just for them, but for a number of different categories to highlight good work so that they could then be recognized and hopefully pull along others to say, well, this isn't as difficult as you might think that it is. It can be done. You can build relationships, so forth and so on. So I think that that's one of the things that we should also be exploring also is so when folks do the right thing, we should applaud them. But I'm also very clear with folks that you should utilize your dollars, just like your vote. I never tell anybody who to vote for, but I say vote for somebody who cares about your community. So we should also utilize our dollars in those corporations and those business entities who are doing the right thing.
Mustafa, are there any, just a quick follow-up, are there any specific policies you see like as easy grabs in the next year that would be helpful?
Well, I like a lot of the work that's happening in California.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say you guys are light years ahead, but you guys are definitely setting the pace, both on the protection side of holding administrations accountable for not doing the right thing, and also being creative in some of the strategic thinking. And it's been going on for a while. AB 32, AB 535. I can go down the list of various things that they have. New York is moving forward on some bills also that can really yield some very positive results. I think what we really need to do is, most everyday folks are getting up, going to work, trying to pay the mortgage and send their kids to school and put some food on the table. They have no idea about these actions that are going on. Until something blows up or, we have a terrible, climatic event that happens. We have to do a better job of helping people to understand what are the pathways forward, what is working, how is it helping them to have a better life, both on the health side and the economic side. And we don't do that enough yet. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we better do that when it comes to that.
So I think we have a really cool opportunity here just with this panel because we have, state government officials, business leaders, non-profit advocacy representatives. You all have a role to play in the next year in helping us achieve climate action. But you guys also work with each other, and you guys can also help each other. So what I want to know is, from each one of you, what would be helpful for the other people on this panel for their institutions to do? Jasper, you're on the corporate side. What would you like to see from state governments in the next year? What would you like to see from advocates in the next year? How could they better help you achieve goals? And
I think it's been, in a way, it's been said, but it's also important just to underline. I think reliability in policy making, so it's not left and right in elections determining it, because we need to make investments that goes over decades maybe. So we need to trust the direction. And today, to be honest, we are taking a lot of leaps of faith. And sometimes we end up in trouble when we invest in wind and suddenly incentives are being removed, etc. These things are putting us being in the front of change in difficult situations. I think reliability, as you spoke about incentivizing, I think, penalizing, incentivizing, but both. And then I think to the rest of the group here, I think by being together and not being in our silos, I have lots of questions and lots of inspiration just listening today, coming to you, Helen, to teach us how to become better in manifesting what we do. We're not so good at that. And I think we sit on a lot of different competencies here to support each other.
Mustafa, how can the corporate community, government community help the advocacy community push this forward?
Well, I take a very holistic approach to everything that I do. So I bring all the various partners in. One of the things that we don't do well yet is utilize cultural influencers. Cultural influencers, no matter what culture you come from, no matter where you come across from the planet, are the ones who are really the drivers, sort of underneath of the level, if you will. I'll give you an example. How many folks in the room know who Beyonce is? Raise your hand if you know who Beyonce is. So everybody look around the room. Please keep your hands up. Everybody keep your hands up. So I think there's only like 1 or 2 hands who are down, and we'll get you some information about this later.
We'll make sure before this panel's over.
And if I ask you, although this is a unique room, how many folks in the room know who 1 or 2 of the top scientists are? So there's a lot less hands that went down. Here's the interesting dynamic, and I've experienced this when I was at the Hip Hop Caucus and other places. If Beyonce says something, literally millions of people will retweet it and go find out more information. When the hurricanes came through Houston and she got engaged in that process, there was a huge amount of attention that came. And I'm blessed that I'm surrounded by some of the best scientists, on the planet around some of these issues. But unfortunately, when they share something, not as many people pay attention. So we should be more focused on who is it that can actually reach people in a non-threatening way and help to get them to open up their minds on information. And you can go through a number of different forms of art that have that ability for us to make real change. You can do it on the voting side, and you can do it also sort of on the education and advocacy side. And for those businesses and others who are good partners, of course, they've understood over the years the utility of having influencers. But I'm talking about cultural influencers, those who are on the local level, sometimes on a regional level, and even on the international level, getting more engaged in the work that needs to happen. And I believe that's how we start to really shift the power structures that are in place.
That makes me think of the media's role too, and I just realized there's also a media person on the panel, me. So, so if you want to address how the media can, I'm not going to answer it, but if you want to, address how the media can better help you guys too, feel free. Mike, same question about the people here on this panel, government representatives, nonprofit leaders, media. How can they help you better achieve climate goals?
Look, I would say all of those things. I think yes, but now from our point of view, which is reliability of policy-making settings and predictability. Countries that have plans for 30 years and then goes predictably through them, businesses can work with that, and that can be very, very helpful. I would say to Wade, just be louder about what you do. Like California, we talk about highlighting great examples, showing that even if you just repeat that job stat continually, right, that would help me in Australia a lot, right? These are sort of examples where you have people out there doing amazing things, and I would say IKEA is a great example of that. We shouldn't be afraid to celebrate, champion, and really get into the details and be able to say, hey, this part was hard, here's how we solved it, this part was a challenge, we had to transition this part over here, and there's challenges in there. It shouldn't be just sort of everything was easy and cupcakes and it was all simple, but where there's successful things, I think celebrating them, and I think cities and states and governments don't actually do that enough. Like there are really interesting cities and states around that actually do that. And then I would agree on the celebrity side of things. As Mustafa said, I think educating some of those celebrities is really important. Where I've failed at the moment in all of the celebrities I've talked to, they're very afraid of speaking out. They're like, I don't know enough that I'm willing to get out there and tweet something, right? Or put it out there. And so that just takes time. That takes education. That takes, hey, this is an important issue. You've got people around you that are going to help you if you get into some troubled waters, but at the same time, don't be afraid to say things where you think they're right. How can I help you understand these issues a bit more? Because, to the media's point, the media has a role to play, but in today's world, there's a huge cut-through of sports people, actors, musicians, all sorts of celebrity who can really get broad attention. I do think it's an interesting point. It's not often brought up on climate panels, but I agree.
Yeah, I might suggest 2 things. I mean, I'd observe, we don't have that many more climate weeks to get it right. And so really 2 things. One is, business leaders actually making their voice heard, as you both are, is very helpful for the elected leaders to do the right thing. Again, because those economic interests that benefit from the status quo, we'll just trot out the same tired jobs versus environment paradigm. And so making it a safe place. But I think more than that, to the advocacy community, change is brought on by popular movements. And if you think about history, you think about the civil rights movement or resistance to Nazism or overturning dictators, those weren't assured. And who drove those? Youth. And so I think we can't discount or underestimate the power of the youth movement just in terms of its moral authority. And I think, Greta Thunberg has been just what this effort needs. So I just think figuring out a way to support that. So, at one level, you're creating this as a safer space for electeds to go, but then creating strong popular movement and pressure. Because, again, the planet we don't really have that much time.
But I think there are things that, again, we were highly successful. One of the successes we have had in Australia. So almost 10% of the 4 million people that turned out were in Australia, which is insane because we have 25 million people. And part of that was just a lot of businesses and other groups getting behind those kids. So, for example, we took a leadership role in saying we support all of our employees' ability to go on strike. Shit, you left work at 12 o'clock, you were back by 3. I mean, it was a long lunch break. It wasn't a huge... When you look at it, it's not a massive commitment, right? And we were pilloried about, you're encouraging employees to strike, this is not what capital should do, and da-da. It's crap, right? And we literally just said, here's what we're encouraging employees to do. We're supporting their right to support the kids, right? It's not about us taking it over. It's supporting them to support those things. We wrote a bunch of, I think, very pragmatic and sensible guidelines internally that we then shared with the world. We said, hey, any other business can take these, right? We've got customer-centric employees. Hey, they have to do other stuff, right? We're not going to put our customers at risk, and that's a fair thing to do. Most businesses have a huge amount of employees that aren't necessary on the front line for a customer on any given time. So I think there are things that business, government, other areas, applaud us to the New York government, I believe, and like the Victorian state government, a few governments who said, state employees can also go and join this sort of thing. So getting behind those kids to help support those movements, there are a lot of things that companies can do. We're not just sitting here saying, it's the kids that are doing a great job. We can put energy behind them without taking it over. They have to lead that.
Helen, did you want to add just something you think?
Yeah, well, no, I think that everyone's covered it really well, and I like this idea around influences. We talk a lot about the climate bubble. There's a lot of us who work on climate, and you think, God, I'm just seeing the same people. We're just, how much are we talking to each other? I mean, it's important that the leaders continue to push and share, but I think, we're seeing now, especially with the climate strikes, we are getting beyond the bubble. And so the more that we can look at interesting ways to do that, and then look at this as there's been a lot of really great work that's been quite top-down by states that have led on this, companies. We're now getting civil society really interested, engaged, and the more we can support that. And I think that does go a bit back to the media. I just wish the media... I notice it again when I come over here, this belief thing. It's like, you're using the wrong verbs. Like, stop it and stop, just referring back to this crazy and diminishing other side, which is treating this as a question of belief. And we've stopped doing that, I think, much better in Europe and other parts of the world. So, the US needs to get a bit more on board with that and stop giving airtime to this. We always say we won't do media interviews if someone's going to use the believe word, because it's not a conversation that I should be having. We should just cut that out. So I think there is this very supportive role. And I'm interested in terms of influencers, you've mentioned people popular with the public. We've got more than 200 companies now in RE100 as of this morning. That's great. We need there to be 2,000. So how are we going to use the influence from businesses one to another? How are you bringing other businesses along? It's not a competitive issue. So how do we make sure that we're sort of challenging that paradigm a bit and getting into that sort of non-competitive space? Because we need to shift where all of us are getting our electrons from. So using that kind of idea of influence as well.
Yep. Jasper, did you want to jump in very quickly?
Maybe very, very quickly. I think also to all of us on the stage and reaching out to companies and organizations. I think this week we have heard a lot about how the youth movement creates hope. And I have to say, I object to that. I think we have to create hope. They are actually expressing worry and anger, not hope. We are the ones who need to provide hope, because we sit on the tools, the responsibility, and the solutions. I think I'm all for what Helen says. We need to step up our game. We need to invite many, many more to actually provide an impact.
We only have a couple minutes, and I want to go down the line and ask everybody to give, just one concrete thing they think people can take away that they can push for, hope for in the next year. But before I do that, I'm maybe going to pose this question to Wade, because there's been a lot of conversation on this panel about the need to work together collaboratively, get out of our bubbles. However, there's a growing movement of people who say that actually, at a certain point, we need to take some people out of the conversation who might not be there in good faith. I'm talking specifically about the fossil fuel industry, which is, as you guys probably know, spent over $2 billion in the last 15 years lobbying against efforts to have effective climate action. And I'm sure there are good faith people in that industry, but the reason this is the climate decade is because we got to do this in a decade. Do we have time to work with the fossil fuel industry as a collaborative partner, or in the next year, do we have to just do things and tell them to fall in line? Wade, I'm gonna pose it to you since you are the Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency.
Well, look, I think we can't be agnostic. The future is a no-carbon future, and that doesn't include fossil fuels. Now, here's the complexity. You walk outside, and 96% of the cars are motored by their product. So how can we move this transition in as fast a way as possible? And I don't think it's about finding a collaborative pathway with fossil fuels, if that's really the thing that we're trying to rid the planet of. But again, it's not as easy as just saying we're not going to use fossil fuels anymore, because our society has become somewhat addicted to it. So how do we drive as aggressive an agenda and drive that transition as fast as possible?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, very quickly, we're pretty much out of time. I just want to go down the line and just, 1 year, give people something to work with.
We're going to fix this.
In a year?
Well, no, in a few more years, but it starts now.
Mustafa, you can go ahead. A concrete action to walk out.
Concrete actions. Get educated on your vote. Get registered to vote. Make sure that you're helping other people get to the polls to vote. Then vote, and then hold people accountable.
I'm going to say something less usual, because I'm sure a lot of you all know this is a highly educated audience. I would say watch your language, to what Helen said, right? Don't let people use the word believe. Don't say the hope is coming from the kids. Say it's our responsibility to give the hope to the kids. Don't let people call them climate science deniers. They're just science deniers. Put a full stop on it. Things like just watching our language can help change the issue, and we can do that in a week.
Just science deniers.
They're science deniers. Full stop. Right?
I like that idea.
That's what it should be.
Two quick things. I would take someone's quote and say, "We are the people we've been waiting for. It's now or never." And everybody in this room, myself included, can do more than we're currently doing. So coming back with the fire in the belly that this existential crisis demands. In terms of concrete, I would say push whatever entity you have the most influence in to expand your renewable energy use and reduce your fossil fuel use. So if you're a member of a company, you're an executive of a company, push. What can we get done? What can we put in place in the next year? If you have influence in your city or town or jurisdiction, same thing. We need to be creating more pressure for clean energy for the future.
Yeah, so I would say to the corporate leaders and the government leaders looking at your commitments and saying, okay, how do I do those quicker? So the ambition is right, but we've got to get there much, much faster, so really pushing that pace. And I totally agree with the vote. Look, in the UK, we're probably going to have like 4 general elections between this year and next. So I think really paying attention as you vote on climate, that's going to make a big difference. So keeping that really front of mind.
Mustafa, do you want to add one thing? Yeah, we got to wrap up.
Help people understand that they have power. Most people don't even believe that they have power because they've never been taught about it. How many folks were taught about power in elementary school? Raise your hand. Middle school, high school, college. So no one in this room has been taught about power. How many folks in the room actually believe you have power? Okay, let's find out. Everybody say power.
Power.
That was just pathetic. Everybody say power.
Power.
This time, put your right hand in the air like it's 1968 at the Olympics. Let it get good to you, like you're actually out with frontline communities. And everybody say power.
Power.
See, if you believe you have power, then you will translate it and you will stop accepting certain things in your life, in your communities, and in your country, and hopefully on this planet. That's how we change it, by people knowing they actually have power.
Well, I think that's a really great point to end on, and we are at a time, so just give a round of applause to our panelists.
So you need to do it.
Right, not IKEA though.
I actually have a bunch of stuff from IKEA in my house.
Thank you for the inspiration.
If I had way more time, I was going to ask about like how you make the most.
Oh. So don't leave. We have 2 more sessions and a wonderful, wonderful session to end on. Yeah.
You and I can just have a conversation.
Because we're going to have 2 Alex conversations. The first one with Alex Liftman of Bank of America. And we were just hearing about, there are different companies that are leading, and Bank of America is certainly one of them. There's obviously more work that needs to be done. And then we're going to end the session with one of our youth leaders who got a little delayed, but she is in the building, and she will be joining us very shortly. So Alex, please.
You going there? Should I come close?
Okay. So those of you who
Our left.
sorry. Can you guys hear me? No.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, but you can't hear me? Is that better?
Better?
Okay, super, super. So Alex Liftman is the Global Environmental Executive at Bank of America and one of our partners and sponsors. And anyone who saw her yesterday was also a terrific speaker at the end of our opening ceremony. So we're just going to have a conversation. Do you want me to take that? I'm more than happy to switch out.
Are these not?
Super.
Okay.
Okay. Can you guys hear that? Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So Alex and I have known each other actually for, gosh, a long, long time, because I started out in the financial services industry, and that's where we met. And so a lot has changed since we first met, but also a lot has sort of stayed the same. But we're going to have a quick conversation about really this next decade ahead. So we were just hearing on our last panel sort of some of the things that businesses and subnational governments can do. But I really wanted to step back and think about this decade ahead, as we're calling it, the climate decade. So how do you sort of balance it personally from sort of the challenge ahead with the hope, but also sort of the concern about the very short time frame that we have to address climate change?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I think like most everyone else, I wake up every morning a little bit terrified and a lot of it energized, terrified, obviously, because we have a decade, and that's a really short period of time for the scale of change that we need. And we're already starting to see impacts today, just everything that we've heard over the past days and weeks and months, starting with July being the hottest month ever in recorded human history. So pretty scared for the future, but really energized. Because we're seeing so much opportunity. I think just speaking within businesses, we see enormous opportunity for the business community. And frankly, we see so much wasted opportunity today. I mean, our research team estimates that we're today losing 1%, possibly as much as 2% of GDP due to climate impacts. And I think, was it Wade from California who was speaking so eloquently about all of the opportunities that we have as businesses actually to address climate. So within our own business, you may know that Bank of America has a $125 billion capital commitment, you certainly know that, to invest and lend towards renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable technologies. And we've been tracking, obviously, the capital, tracking the environmental benefits for a really long time. But several years ago, we actually started tracking the economic benefits of that capital that gets deployed. And just tracking 40% of the capital that we had dedicated by the end of 2018, that helped to contribute to the creation of 160,000 jobs. 160,000 jobs, mostly here in the US. And those jobs pay well over the national average from a salary perspective. And it contributed about $51.4 billion to GDP. And we're one company, this tiny microcosm. So I agree with Wade. We're already creating jobs today. We're already contributing to GDP. And frankly, if we don't address this challenge, we're losing GDP. So I actually think that this whole argument of environment versus business, I agree. I think it's a red herring.
And so we heard on the last session, I think from Mustafa as well as Mike, is that some of these stories are still not getting out there enough. So do you feel like Bank of America is able to tell that story of how you are creating jobs and the good investments that you're making are helping all around for the economy?
I hope so. I mean, we are certainly telling it in every forum. I know a lot of the panels have been about influence. We certainly have a lot of different levels of influence. We employ 250,000 people, so we're obviously trying to just get our employees really engaged. We, as a corporate leader, in a lot of forums with other corporate leaders, so we're telling that story with other companies. But most importantly, our bankers are super engaged, so they're out there talking to their clients. So I do think that, I hope that message is really starting to resonate.
So I know you talked about your commitment, and I know you guys have increased your commitment recently. So do you want to just talk about that a little bit? And also, we heard a bit like, is that enough? And clearly it's not enough, but it'd be good just to hear your thinking around how you were able to increase that commitment.
Absolutely. So we are in the throes of closing out our second environmental business commitment, the 125 that I just talked about. In fact, we may have already met it. I don't have third quarter reporting, but we'll definitely meet it by the end of this year. And that was 125. So our CEO earlier in the year in April, understanding we were going to meet the commitment this year ahead of time, went ahead and actually set a really ambitious goal for the bank, like our climate decade commitment, if you will, for the next decade, that we would deploy or facilitate the deployment of $300 billion in capital to renewable energy, energy efficiency, sustainable technologies, just a lot of capital. But no, it's not enough. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of $750 billion being invested in these areas on an annual basis. We know we need to get that to about 2.3 trillion. So it's not enough, but we are certainly working with peers and our client base to really try to outrun that commitment, right? That's the commitment we've made, but we've met all of our commitments well in advance, and I think we will try and do that with this commitment.
And we chatted a little bit about, obviously, Bank of America banks America as well as much of the world, and so you still have clients that are maybe not as leading as you are as a company. And so how do you work with those clients and help them sort of with the transition, sort of the point that Helen had made earlier? A lot of the companies, if they're not addressing climate change, chances are their business model will really be challenged over the next very few years.
Yeah, and we're spending a lot of time talking to our clients about that issue. I mean, clearly, as a financial institution who is banking these clients, it is not just within their best interest, but it's within our best interest to ensure that those clients are sustainable for the long term. So it starts with our banking team, and I will say we have an incredibly engaged banking team. Actually, just as a funny anecdote, our head of energy and power for the bank is a guy by the name of Nick McKee, who's lovely and wonderful and super engaged and spending a lot of time talking to his clients. And I've been running into him randomly throughout this week at various different events, to which I have not invited him, but to which he has been invited by a number of different players within this space. That just tells you how engaged he is in these topics. So he's spending a lot of time. He's a total believer, but he's also somebody who really understands the energy and power industry. Frankly, those are the people we need, right? So he is spending a lot of time talking to his clients about what is their plan, but importantly as a bank, how do we help them? How do we help them with financing? How do we help them overcome other obstacles? We are a firm believer in engagement. I know that there are lots of different models out there. There are certainly institutions that are more on the divestment side of the equation. We as a bank, will draw hard lines when we feel that that's appropriate and necessary, and we certainly have, and we've taken leadership positions in doing so. But in general, we do feel strongly that we have influence with our clients. We are able to engage them and help to move them forward. If we divest, we've walked away from the table. Our influence to the point of influence is gone, right? So that's really what we're trying to use our influence in that way.
And how you guys have both, you have joined both RE100 as well as EV100, so committing to 100% renewable electricity as well as electric vehicle infrastructure. So does that help you when you're talking to your clients too? Can you just expand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, having that experience, I think, is really valuable. And I should give a huge shout out, by the way. I mean, I love to take credit for those things, but it's actually Beth Watias who's very modestly and quietly sitting. Actually, Lisa Spritz started those leadership positions and Beth took them over. And they're both sitting modestly and quietly in the back of the room, but they really have led in that space. But yeah, having committed as an institution ourselves to be 100% renewable, Beth really has an approach where she is trying to do that in a really innovative way. We're not just buying RECs, you're right, we're putting solar panels on our facilities. She's looking at PPAs. I mean, having that experience and being able to, Beth meets with our clients almost as much as I do, right? Because she's talking them through, how do you do this? And the same on EV100. We're committing to putting infrastructure in our largest locations. How do we talk to our clients about doing that? I think it's really powerful. So certainly we do it with our peers. We spend a lot of time with our peers, walking them through. We spend a lot of time with other corporates, but our clients are the biggest opportunity.
Which is terrific because we're like at 200 companies that have committed to RE100, and clearly we have a lot more to get there. Right. And so maybe just touch upon like how else you think you can bring in more businesses to take a leadership like Bank of America.
Well, I think much of what I've just said in terms of really collaborating in all of the various different venues in which we operate. So we're trying to look at things like, how do we work with other banks beyond, we spend a lot of time, Val Smith and Matt Arnold, we talk about co-opetition. That's Val's favorite. And by the way, they're my peers at Citi and JP Morgan. So we spend a lot of time with our peers, but also looking at how do we use, like the ABA relationship to get to mid-sized banks and smaller-sized banks. So how do we use collaboration aside from our role as just a corporate leader and aside from our role as a financier? How do we, it's one of the tenets of what our CEO, Brian Moynihan, has said is just every tool in the toolbox. How do we take every tool in the toolbox to address this issue? So influence, relationships, our financing, our own operations. How do we get all of our employees thinking about it across the bank?
So speaking of your employees, and then we can sort of segue into youth. Well, first of all, yesterday when John Kerry was on stage, I think anybody who heard him, he got choked up when he was talking about as he was signing the Paris Agreement. Those of you might remember, he had his granddaughter on his lap. And he got choked up because he realized we are not meeting those commitments. So youth, yes, our future, and also your future employees. So how do you sort of think about the climate strikes that we saw on Friday and sort of the engagement of youth and the next generation of employees for Bank of America?
Yeah. Well, I have a 15-year-old and an 18-year-old. So I'm living youth in my household. And I actually thought, I can't remember who said it on the last panel, but I thought what they said was really powerful about how we have to give hope to the next generation, not expect the next generation to give us hope. That actually made me start to cry, because I think we have really sort of sapped hope out of this generation. So the youth movement is incredibly important, and I have no idea of the numbers, but I really think we're getting tantamount to the type of youth involvement that we had like in the Vietnam War here in the U.S. And I think that really can inspire a lot of change. To your point, they are our future employees, they are our future customers. future shareholders. So we have to pay attention to them. But I would say, I think there's a lot of engagement. There's so much focus on youth right now, but those youth all have parents, right? And I think there's just a lot of engagement around this issue in general. I mean, we're seeing it. We have 23,000 employees across the bank that are part of our My Environment program. That's more than 10% of the bank's employee base. And for anyone who runs an employee engagement program, that's off the charts. I mean, off the charts. Like usually if you have an employee engagement program and 5% of your employees actively participate, that's like a good number. We have like 12. And we're trying to grow that, but that's huge. And I think it just shows you that employees are, just people in general of all ages are already engaged. But I think this youth movement is definitely a wake-up call to all of us.
Well, I think it's our time. We're going to wrap up. But thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for supporting Climate Week. We couldn't all convene without you as our partner. So really, really appreciate it. And thank you for all the work.
Well, thank you for your leadership.
So I am still missing. She's here. Hello. Oh, there you are. Hi. Okay. So great. So I am delighted to introduce our next speaker. I'm holding the mics. There isn't too much feedback. But anyway, as we all did witness on Friday, the youth climate strikes were really incredible. I don't know how many people were down there. I was there trying to find my son, who was wandering around, I know, with his school, his entire school. So really just the ability to be able to introduce this next speaker, I'm thrilled. Her name is Alexandria Villasenor. And Alexandria is a 14-year-old climate activist here in New York City, and she started out last December sitting in front of the UN, very much inspired by Greta, if I recall. I think my son has been there for a couple times with you, but he's normally in school. And anyway, she is here to give us some thoughts about what we are all doing here and how we need to do more. So Alexandria, please join the stage.
Can you hear me this way? I'll do it. Okay. Hello, everyone. So my name is Alexandria Villasenor. I'm a 14-year-old climate activist in New York City, and I've been on climate strike every Friday for the past 42 weeks in solidarity with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. But my story really does start before I started my climate strike. I was visiting family back in Northern California, where I was born and raised, when the Paradise Fire broke out. So Paradise Fire quickly became California's worst wildfire in its history. Many people died and lost their homes, and a lot of people lost their loved ones. And so I was so close to Paradise. My family had received a lot of the smoke in the surrounding area, and the smoke was seeping into my house. I had to roll up wet towels, put them under windows and doors to keep the smoke from seeping in. And as well, in the community, people were handing out these face masks to keep you from inhaling the smoke. But what I then realized is that those face masks never kept out the particles that were really harmful. And that was one of the first things that I realized about how we are so unprepared for the future of the climate crisis. And so since my asthma was being inflamed so much by the smoke, my family had to send me back to New York City early. And at that point, I was so upset and angry because all of my friends and family were still back in California, still in that smoke for many weeks after I'd left. It was so upsetting. And so I started to research the effects of wildfires, and that's how I came across the connection between climate change and California's wildfires. So from that, it made me want to really do something and take action. And that's why after I came across Greta Thunberg at COP24, it had really empowered me to go out and join her and make my voice heard as a young person. And that's when I started my school strike for climate. And so I then got connected with students all over the world, and we started to plan for the first ever global climate strike that occurred on March 15th, where 1.6 million students in 125 countries went on school strike for climate demanding action from their world leaders. And we decided that even after March 15th, we still needed to continue doing it. So on May 3rd, there was a national climate strike. And here in New York City, there was over 2,000 students who had a sit-in on the Brooklyn Bridge, demanding that the mayor declared a New York City climate emergency. And of course, we were very disappointed when he didn't. But that same day, we learned that New York City Council had drafted a climate emergency resolution. So we knew that they needed our help to make that happen. And so on May 24th, where 1.9 million students all over the world went on climate strike, we did start to get that momentum here in New York City. And so on June 26th, we finally got that climate emergency passed. And that's just one example about how when you set your mind to something, you can really make an accomplishment. And that's what the youth movement does, is we have goals and demands. And so some of you may have attended the climate strike that happened this past Friday, September 20th. And so here in New York City, the estimate was 300,000 people went on climate strike, and internationally, 4 million students in 170 countries. So the movement is continuing to grow for children. And so the climate crisis is continuing to get more urgent. And we are finding new ways to take action and to make our voices heard to world leaders. So yesterday was September 23rd, the first day of the United Nations Climate Summit. Myself, Greta Thunberg, and 14 other children from all around the world filed a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, to 5 countries, saying that they are violating our rights as children. And so we are going to be taking them to international court. Now, I can't remember all the other petitioners' names, but I recommend that you go look at this case at childrenversusclimatecrisis.org, because students are now going to be fighting ways to really make our voices heard through legal actions, civil disobedience, and so many other ways. So please, I hope you support children and youth. Thank you.
Alexandria, and you know, I think one thing that's come out of this morning, we've been talking about this kind of a handover between the youth who are really setting this challenge to us. We know what we've got to do in the next 10 years. We've got to get on and deal with it, deliver these changes. We cannot wait these amazing people, young people, to grow up and climb the corporate ladder themselves. You know, we can't delegate this to them. They are setting us a challenge, and we have to rise to that challenge. So with that, I will send you all on your way. There's sustenance out there somewhere. And please stick with us for the next 2 days of lots of good events. Thank you.